Good afternoon. I'm Rosalind Layton, founder of ChinaTechThreat. Just yesterday, AP reported that last year alone, China attacked at least 6 U.S. state government computer networks. This news is disturbing, but not surprising. State governments are vulnerable because they unwittingly purchase equipment from Chinese government vendors, products which are designed to facilitate intrusion, and they, in fact, can be compelled to surveil and spy on subjects who use these products. As we see with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, attacks can play out in both physical as well as cyberspace. A critical line of Ukraine's defense to its cyber strength, both in manpower and secure infrastructure. Ukraine's ability to stand up to Russia relates in large part to a 2014 decision to end dependency on Russian technology. This is something Americans can learn from. U.S. state government unwittingly purchases unsafe equipment like Lenovo laptops, Lexmark printers, and Hikvision video cameras. Because of these vulnerabilities and these products, federal agencies like the Department of Defense are not allowed to purchase them. But these rules don't necessarily apply to states. Today, we focus on New York. It is our most populous state with 20 million people. Its economy generates $2 trillion annually and is home to the world's financial markets, many corporate headquarters, leading universities, and even semiconductor manufacturing. New York State government regulates the operation of these industries, and it collects confidential information from companies and sensitive information from individuals. However, as ChinaTechThreat has uncovered, New York State government has spent tens of millions of dollars on unsafe computer equipment on which New Yorkers' information could potentially be processed and stored, making it vulnerable to the Chinese government. Today, Congressman Claudia Tenney joins us. She represents New York's 22nd District, and she's here to discuss ending the dependency on Chinese technology. Welcome, Congresswoman. Please tell us what concerns you about New York's vulnerabilities in Chinese technology.
Thank you for having me on, and thank you for highlighting this really important issue. Obviously, the issue with China has been one for me as a small business owner, but also a resident of New York, where you cited we have a large population, we have a lot of corporate interests, and my district is also home to the Air Force Research Lab Directorate, which is prestigious in terms of the Air Force directorates around the nation. We also have Utica University, Binghamton University, and others that are engaging in important technologies in our future. So it was really concerning for me by the refusal of our state officials to really take China seriously and the China technology threat seriously. And, by exposing potentially our business community, our state government officials, our local government officials to the ability of China to spy on us. And as you just reported, the Associated Press report that Chinese government-backed hackers actually got into the computers of 6 states, which we don't know which they are. We're assuming maybe New York is one of them. We don't know. But this could be a real problem for the security of our individuals, our residents of the state, citizens of the state, and our local governments are exposed, and we just don't know what has happened, which is why I generated a letter to our current governor, Kathy Hochul, and asked her to look into these issues. We have yet to receive a response, though we demanded some kind of response, at least by the end of December, and now we're into March, and we have no response from the governor, and yet they continue to buy products from companies you cited, like Lexmark, Hikvision, and others who are part of their Chinese own interests at this point.
Well, in many cases, they were founded by the government itself. I mean, if you look at Lenovo, that was seeded by in the Chinese Academy of Sciences specifically for their nationalist champion program. You are at least one person who's taking action on this, and thank you. I know that you reached out to the governor, you and your delegation. It's unfortunate you've not heard back. You've taken leadership on a number of issues of equipment and technology. I believe also drones. We can look at DJI, which is a Chinese drone maker, has lead market share in the U.S. Maybe you could tell us some of your work there, and perhaps is that a solution where we could look at addressing some of the other risks.
Yeah, well, also, as you know, U.S. law enforcement agencies are taking a stand, just such as the FBI, the Secret Service, and looking at this technology and this Chinese-owned DJI. Unfortunately, an FCC Commissioner Brendan Carr has also brought this to the front and center, and Treasury Department, in addition, added them to the investment blacklist. And there's a lot of this happening, but in the state of New York, we're not seeing any restrictions coming down on DJI, which could put us in a real vulnerable position. Which is why, again, I implore the governor to actually look into these issues and what DJI is doing. I mean, some of the malicious activities they're doing, they use technology to spy on their own people, the Uyghurs and others with this technology, while they use forced labor and also genocide against their own people in different parts of the Chinese continent.
Yes, I think this is something that Americans should recognize. They may come into contact with an employee working at one of these companies in the U.S. It could even be an American. It's not the fault of the employees of these companies, but it's Chinese law and practice that a Chinese person has to spy if the government requests it. And they have an IT law, which requires any data made on any Chinese device anywhere in the world is subject to the Chinese government's purview and authority. There's no, warrant. There's no judicial redress. There's none of these protections that we might know of in the US or in Europe. That just doesn't exist. So this is not something that the employees of a Chinese firm could work against. This is just what the government does.
Well, and that's incredibly true when you have an authoritarian regime, and we have vulnerable and often naive companies and government agencies that don't realize what they're subjecting our personal data to. And our personal information could be right now in Chinese hands. They could be spying on us. They could be using high vision technology, DJI drones, and all of this, maybe innocently by the Americans, or maybe because they're seeking to capitalize on, in a less expensive technology that the Chinese company provides, but they're putting us in grave risk and putting our population at grave risk. And it's really concerning to me that the state of New York does nothing about this. And, this is not new. This is something that actually was started by Andrew Cuomo when he combined the banks and the insurance institutions in New York State and forced them to turn over the personal data of all of these different customers, something that banks and insurance companies spend billions of dollars protecting. That's their stock and trade, is their ability to protect their consumers and their customers, and to force them to turn it over to these more vulnerable platforms like New York State required, just exposes their customers and the banks to liability, but exposes the customers to interventionists like the Chinese government. As you know, we have no rules stopping them from, the Chinese state-owned agencies and the government from requiring that information to be in turn turned over to them. Now, do we know if this is actually happening? Probably not yet, but we may. And this is the kind of investigation we need to take. This is why it's so important that the federal agencies and the state agencies comply with this. So that some of the laws that are put in place by DOJ, by FCC, and others to make sure that that information is not being leveraged by the Chinese government once that information is disclosed through state agencies. We reached out to when Cuomo actually first did this. We as a conference and many members when I was in the assembly reached out, and now the same thing is happening through the purchase of Chinese equipment. Who knows what's embedded in these Lexmark and quality, printers, and especially in the Lenovo computers? We don't know. We don't know what's embedded in these drones that are being, purchased by the state agencies. And why don't we know who these 6 states are, which is something I assume we'll get to, that were hacked by Chinese computers? So we know that it's out there. We know the Chinese are doing this. They are malevolent. They are the U.S. They're our biggest adversary in the world, as horrible as Putin is. And we know that they engage in cyber warfare as well. The kind of destruction and tragedy that we're seeing unfold in Ukraine is already happening in some cases in China. I mean, the Chinese people are surveilling their own population. They're surveilling our Olympic athletes that were over there. They're committing genocide. They're doing involuntary organ donations on Uyghurs and other people that are not part of their, exalted population or the elite status. And yet we're buying from these companies. We have, foreign agents in this country, and also I know agents that advocate for them in the state and local government, state and federal government. So, I mean, it's time now for us to wake up. If we think what Putin is doing is so terrible, which it is, it's horrendous to watch this great human tragedy and aggression against an unprovoked sovereign country like Ukraine is happening. Think about what the Chinese are doing to their neighbors in the South China Sea, whether you start with Tibet and other countries, and think about the terror that is in the eyes of these people when the US is weak. And think about what could happen to the people of Taiwan if we don't stand up and defend freedom and defend these countries around the world, and particularly in the cyberspace and technology.
I could not have said it better, Congresswoman. I mean, consider Taiwan has 92% of the world's advanced manufacturing in semiconductors. I mean, if China invades Taiwan, it's World War III, and it's too late for us to rip and replace the Chinese equipment they have. I mean, there are so many scenarios describing how China wages a cyber warfare on the U.S. with the technology which we have purchased ourselves and embedded all throughout our infrastructure, and that enables their remote access, the semiconductor chips in the fighter jets, the ordinary laptops in your office, the server in your back office. All of those things which we purchased from China could be weaponized. So that's not a far-fetched scenario.
Right. And you look at China, I mean, they are actually a dominating power in the world. They have a strong economy. They have an authoritarian regime with global power around the world, with leveraging their infrastructure with other countries, their money, their military is, and not to mention their hypersonic technology. Everything they're doing is ahead of us. And think about the grave threat that they pose in just contrast to what we're seeing Putin doing in Ukraine with an economy the size of the state of Texas, projecting themselves as a world power when they're not. Imagine when we start to tangle with an actual world power like China. We are in grave conditions if we don't think that they're going to use cyber, and already are probably using their cyber dominance against us right now, their technology dominance right now. We have got to wake up. This is an urgent situation. I'm sure that Xi Jinping is empowered. And think about this. When we were looking to prevent this from happening, this terrible invasion into Ukraine, the Biden administration shared vital intelligence information with the Chinese, thinking that they would be on our side, only to have them share that with the Russians and with Putin. This is the kind of naivete and the kind of administration that we have now in place. We need to wake up. We need to have our state governments also aware of this, because China is not going to roll tanks into the United States. They are rolling their cyber dominance, their economic dominance, and their leverage in an authoritarian regime that that they have no concern about civil casualties in their own communities, in their own country. It's about world domination and power. And we are projecting weakness at the most critically important time in our country's future and history.
Well, Congresswoman Tenney, you have been so generous with your time. I'm truly grateful that you have taken time away. I know it's a busy day with votes, and I want you to get back there and do the job you need to do to keep us safe. So thank you so much for joining us at ChinaTechThreat. I hope that you will come back again, and we appreciate your leadership on this vital issue.
Thanks so much, Rosalind, and keep the good reporting. We need to get the truth out to the American people, particularly to people who are serving in leadership positions in both the federal and the state governments across the nation. We need to make sure that we prioritize this issue with China today, not yesterday, or not tomorrow, but today. It's got to be done. So thank you so much. I appreciate the time.
Absolutely. So we are going to switch gears and talk with our second guest today. Joseph Steinberg is a cybersecurity expert. He wrote Cybersecurity for Dummies. At that, he is an expert in many fields: artificial intelligence, privacy, has been working in this domain for more than 10 years. He knows everything there is to know about this. And I'm so glad that he could join us from New York City itself. So thank you, Joe. I know that I would like to give you a chance to respond to what the Congresswoman said. I know that you have a lot of top-line thoughts. Would you please let us? So what are your response to what she shared?
So first of all, thank you for having me. As you mentioned, I've been talking about the China threat for well over a decade. This is a real problem. This is not crying wolf. This isn't paranoia. China is really the first existential threat to the United States, possibly since the War of 1812. Uh, we haven't faced an adversary that is really of equal power in many ways. Even the Soviet Union was always self-destructing because of an imploding system. We may not have known it at the time, but it really couldn't compete economically or in other ways. China does. This is a real competitor. And there is a fundamental difference that was alluded to by the Congresswoman and by yourself, which is the American government works for the American people. We choose our representatives. They report to us. If we don't like what they're doing, we can replace them. The Chinese government is the opposite. It rules over their people and it's abusive. And it's important to understand that difference because while our government is interested in protecting the rights of people and in keeping the American people happy and safe, the Chinese government is interested in power and dominance. And they've made that very clear in different ways. I mean, we see it with their human rights abuses. We see it with their cyber behavior, their total lack of disrespect for intellectual property. This is not surprising. And with the news that you mentioned yesterday, that came out yesterday, of this report that 6 states had been breached by Chinese spies. Personally, I like to express it differently, which is if we know that 6 states were breached by Chinese spies, what it means is we know that 44 states probably have Chinese spies operating on their networks that we don't know about. They've been spying on everything, and it's in their interest to do so. It's just that we're not taking the risk seriously. We're not taking the threat seriously. And that's why we need to start having this conversation as a nation. It's not a partisan issue. It's a national security issue. It's a way of life issue. It's an American way of life issue, and we really need to start talking about it.
So you've seen this on for 10 years, and I think for many people, they feel like they've been saying the threat, they've been demonstrating the threat. We have the evidence in court about, the back channels with Lenovo back to China, to the Chinese government. We have it with Huawei, we have it with Vision, and so many others. And for many people, it falls on deaf ears. In fact, we even see, companies that have invested in selling this equipment want to keep going, and they're denying that these things go on. So how can you explain, you've seen this for so many years, the sort of not wanting to believe that this is real? How do you account for that?
I think it's actually quite simple. Holiday season, if you go online and people are buying electronics for gifts, and there's an American made product, and there's an American company selling that product, and it has the same features as a Chinese product, but it's 3 times the price. Which one do you think sells better? Right? We have no rules regulating what comes into the country from China. You can buy anything online, it's shipped directly in. I had this conversation with people at the FCC. It's nice that the FCC is starting to put in all sorts of restrictions and regulations in terms of what they're approving, but you don't need FCC approval to buy electronics in the US. You can import it straight from China online yourself as a consumer. And because of agreements that were established in the past, it cost the Chinese companies almost nothing to ship it here. So you have a situation where people are importing products, not knowing who made them, what's in them, and attaching them to networks in the US because it's cheaper. And we have no rules preventing that. We have no incentives to stop it. We're ignoring it. I sometimes say when the Greeks put the Trojan horse outside of Troy, they at least gave it as a gift, right? The Trojans took it because it was free. We're buying the stuff that's going to create the problems for us. Is already crying. We're spending money putting equipment that could be spying on us on our own networks. It's insane, and we're just ignoring it.
So for those who want to do something about this problem, they maybe they're running a home network or an office network. They don't know where to begin. They don't know what's in their network. Are there any strategies or solutions or products out there to help identify malign equipment in a network?
Sure. So I think there's a difference between consumers and businesses in this regard. If you're a consumer, if you're buying major brand products on a reliable marketplace or in a reliable American store, and there's a brand on the product that is a brand that you recognize and is not something that you've never heard of with no FCC stickers or what have you or symbols on it, that's a good first step. when you're buying gifts and you see that, there's a camera from a brand and a camera from, no brand online, let's say on a marketplace where there are direct sellers from China, and most major market players have those today, including Amazon and eBay. Um, you know, see the difference, understand the difference. And by the way, it's not just about spyware. There may not be security protocols in the products themselves that are as good as they should be. And it could be that other hackers will get into it. It could be that the products won't be supported properly. And if a vulnerability is found, it won't get fixed. And other hackers could get into it. It doesn't matter whether it's Chinese spying from the government or other people coming in. You don't want vulnerable equipment in there. Obviously, the prime candidate for that spying, we all know who it is. But the reality is you could have problems even beyond that. So that's from the consumer side. From the business side, one of the problems is businesses don't know what's on their networks. It's not just a matter of equipment with Chinese branded, labels on the outside of it. When you buy a Mac or you buy a Windows computer, you don't know what chips are in there. Even when it's from an American brand, you don't know what's on your network cards. You don't know what you have. You can buy 100 laptops from one vendor and they could all have different cards in there because they got them from different suppliers. So there are technologies. One of the companies, for example, that I advise is a company called Sepio that actually does hardware analysis. They look at what is actually out there. What is the hardware? And so you can create sort of an inventory of what the actual hardware in your environment is. And if you start seeing either vulnerable components or components from factories that are in China somewhere that are suspected of having connections to a government or what have you, and you don't want those in your network, you can at least identify it and address it. But this is a big picture problem. These are all solutions that we need to do at the end because we haven't dealt with it at a government level. These things should not be entering the country. It's a Trojan horse. And even if they're not spying today, as you alluded to, and as the Congresswoman alluded to, it doesn't mean they're not going to do it in the future. So they could be pushing out perfectly legitimate products now with the hope that if people keep buying enough of them, at some point in the future, they're going to load something into the supply chain, a little spyware on a chip. And who's going to find it? Are manufacturers who are embedding Chinese chips going through every single gate on the chip to look what's there? They're not. They're buying the chips. And that's the problem. We don't know what could come in the future either.
Well, I'm glad you had made that distinction about consumers and businesses. And we should give the FCC some credit for making a start of this. Right now, they're just restricting 5 companies. But even the challenge there, what they recognized is, for example, Huawei had some restrictions on one little, the ability to access 5G chips. Well, even after that was placed, Huawei was still granted 3,000 equipment licenses. So you could buy other Huawei products. And so if you look at this, there's literally thousands of Chinese companies that would have to be sanctioned and restricted. And so what the FCC started to do was to look at some big names. I think that, there's this idea of putting DJI. They should put Lenovo on there. There are a number of large, in fact, brand name companies now. And as we know, Lenovo purchased IBM as a way to get into the American market and win the trust. But that is an example where the consumer could see perhaps a trusted name, but they have no idea, what that means and where it comes from. And this is definitely where the government has to play a role to educate the consumer and protect the consumer.
Right. There's an education issue and there's a regulation issue. You can't go out and if you're building a house buy, build without a permit or, design your own thing architecturally without getting the plans approved. But when it comes to technology, we allow that. You can hook up anything you want with a network port or with wireless capabilities to an American ISP. You can. It's really insane if you think about it. You could buy something that could be intended to attack the Pentagon and hook it up to a network, and there's no crime involved in doing that because you didn't intend to do that. You just bought it from some manufacturer overseas you never heard of. We have no safety codes. And unlike fire and unlike Army, you can't outsource this, right? We can all hire a police department to protect us from crime or a fire department to deal with our fires. You can't outsource cybersecurity. If you're hooking up stuff in your house and it's starting to propagate stuff across the internet, it's going to cause a problem for other people. And that's why this has to be dealt with on a national level. The states need to deal with it now because it's urgent and it's happening now, but it really needs to be the federal government that puts in not just mandates, but mechanisms to prevent these problems from happening. Again, People think this is like an alarmist attitude or it's a problem in the future. It's a problem now. And they don't understand the scale of it. So I actually want to give one example. The person who is going to be president of the United States in 30 years and 40 years from now, that person's medical information is probably in the hands of the Chinese government because
Well,
they've gotten
and
all of it.
that person is probably using TikTok today, and that is being
Correct.
used in a social credits file,
Absolutely.
some kind of personal file for ways to find how to compromise that person, how to turn that person, should he or she become president, or doesn't have to be
Correct.
president, could be a congressperson, could be,
Congress
anyone,
people, court,
could be
judges. The Chinese, if they
business
collect enough
leaders.
data, yeah, if
Yes.
they collect enough data, and storing data is free, and all the encryption that we're using today will be broken by quantum within decades anyway, so they could store it encrypted. They're going to have all this data about all the American people, the people who are in leadership positions. They're going to know every possible detail to blackmail them. If somebody had a drug problem as a teenager and never, it didn't come out at a campaign and the Chinese know it, think about how that could be used. There's so many possible things that could come out, and we're doing nothing about it. They're collecting all this data, and we're saying, here, come on our networks and collect more. It's crazy.
Yeah. Well, Joe, we just have time for one more question, and I want to just turn our attention to the situation now in Ukraine and what we see in many American tech companies leaving Russia in protest. And we've seen literally hundreds of Fortune 500, Apple, Google, a lot of well-known companies. But it's interesting where we see a lot of the Chinese state-owned companies like Huawei, they're just sitting pretty. They're actually expecting to come in and take the spoils of what the Americans
Yeah.
leave it when they exit Russia. But it's curious that there was a Wall Street Journal report, I think yesterday or before, that some of the companies attempted to announce leaving and then had to walk it back because of a backlash from China. So I just wanted to get your take, because we've seen American companies exit Russia, the Lenovo's and Huawei's and DG's car hailing services, they are continuing to operate in Russia.
These are complex issues that many have tried to make simple. Hey, everybody should stop doing business in Russia. That is not the case. Because if by leaving, for example, we compromise national security by allowing the Chinese to get a foothold in areas that we were conducting espionage operations, that would be a disaster. And the American public doesn't know where we're conducting espionage operations. By the way, I've made the same comment about all these hackers around the world attacking Russian websites. I think it's a tremendous mistake. I wrote a piece yesterday about how Putin could be thanking them. When they're defacing websites and defacing fuel pumps, they're telling Putin where the cyber vulnerabilities are without inflicting real damage. And if Western governments, if the CIA or MI6 or whoever was in these systems and was going to inflict real damage or conducting real espionage, these hackers have probably undermined major operations. They defaced fuel pumps, for example. If we had access to those fuel pumps, potentially we could have shut them off, which means we could have caused a problem for the army to fuel tanks as they were moving. But now we can't, potentially, because somebody defaced them, told the Russians, hey, there's a vulnerability here, and they fixed it. So all these issues are much more complicated than people think. Sometimes abandoning Russia can actually harm national security and help the Chinese, who are, as you said, much more dangerous, big picture than the Russians. In ways. Remember, the Russians are having problems coming into the Ukraine. If you think, and their economy is the size of one U.S. state. It's not even as big as California's economy. Imagine what China, with an economy much, much larger, a military much, much larger, cyber capabilities much, much larger, could inflict damage-wise. We do not want the Chinese to be in a position of power and spreading influence and spreading cyber capabilities, which is what's happening as American tech companies leave Russia. So there are occasions where they should leave. There are occasions where they should not leave. And my suspicion is that in some of the cases where they have not left, U.S. government may be asking them not to leave because there are operations being conducted that we don't want to stop. And if they pull out, we're going to lose the ability to conduct them.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's Joseph Steinberg, author of Cybersecurity for Dummies. You can check him out online. We will link to his excellent work on ChinaTechThreat. Thank you for joining us this afternoon, and we will see you next time.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.